Hey guys, so this is the 15th part in this Python tutorial series for beginners, and in this one we're going to be talking about a type of data structure in Python. So it's going to allow you to be able to store multiple data items inside of Python in a very concise way that's easy for you to access, and that's called a Python list. So it's just a list of items that have the same data type, so it could be a string or an integer or some other data type, and you can store that in such a way that it's really easy to access each of those elements, and it's nice and fast for Python to be able to process it a lot of the time, and it's just sort of easier to program with in general, especially when you have large amounts of data to be able to deal with that and store that data in your program. So let's go ahead and jump straight into Python, and I'm just going to start by defining a list. So I'm going to say names, for example, and we're going to say a list, which is a square brackets. So if you've seen my video on the for loop, you might have seen a little bit of these Python lists, because I did use an example of a Python list to demonstrate the for loop. I'll show you that again now if you haven't seen that example. But I'm going to do a couple of names here. So let's say John, Bob, Robert, and Ellie. Right, so we've got 4 names here, and these are all string data types, which means that's okay to put them in a list because they have the same data type. And what I mean by that is, this part can't be an integer if this one's a string. That just wouldn't work. It wouldn't make sense for Python. So now that I've hit enter, Python has stored that in its memory, so I can type names and I can see that. So that's a good start. I've got that data now stored in the program in Python in quite a nice concise way. I don't have to have 4 different variables for John, Bob, Robert and Ellie separately. So that's really good. But how do I access that? If I want just one data item, I need to be able to access that so that I can just get John's information, for example. So the way that we do that normally is through what's called an index. So John, like each of these elements in this list, has a number assigned to it, and that's what we mean by when we say the list index. So John has the number 0 from left to right, so 0, 1, 2 and 3, because computers, remember, they always start at 0. So if we want the first element, if we type names, we then put the square brackets there, and we can say 0. That's going to give us the first element, because remember, computer starts from 0, not 1. So a lot of people try to do this. They'll put names and they'll say 1, expecting it to be John, but it's actually going to come back with Bob, because that's actually the element with the index of 1, because it's 0, 1, 2 and 3. So what else can we do? So we could do something like names, and we could say with the square bracket, we could have the element 2 to 3. So if we press enter, it just returns Robert. Okay, so let me just sort of explain that, why it's just done that. So 2, so it looks at the element in the list with index 2, and it includes that, and then it goes up to, so it'll include all the elements up to, but not including the element with index 3. So if I wanted to do names, I could do 0, for example, and 2. That returns John and Bob, because it's the 2 elements. So the reason for it returning John and Bob is because John has the index of 0, Bob has 1, so it goes 0, 1, up to, but not including 2, or the element with the index of 2, so in this case Robert, so it doesn't include that. So that's good. So you could also, if you didn't want to specify both numbers, you could do something like colon 3, so I didn't put a number here like that, for example, and if you run that, then what that says essentially is just get all the elements up to but not including the element with the index of 3. So in this case Ellie has the index of 3 and it just looks up to but not including that element. So that's a really good way of doing it. You can also do, for example, names. Let's say, for example, you had a really long list of names and there are a million elements in this list. For example, you've got maybe a massive data structure with a large amount of data items in it. So what if the element that you want is 3 from the end, for example? How are you going to access that? Are you going to have to sort of count each one to find the right index? Because that would take a long time. You'd have to sort through all that data before you get to the one that's actually correct. So to sort of solve this issue, what you can do is use a negative value. And let's show you with -2, for example. What this does is, instead of looking from left to right, so remember it's positive numbers going this way, so 0, 1, 2 and 3, what the negative numbers say is we're going to look from right to left instead. So Ellie has also got an index of -1, and then going backwards, Robert's got an index of -2, -3 and then -4 respectively. So if we hit this, we can see it returns Robert, which is because this is -1 and this is -2. So that's a really good way of accessing elements as well, and being able to do that sort of, especially if you've got large data structures, that can be quite useful to be able to do. What else can you do with a list? For example, you could iterate through it like with a for loop. I'll just show you this in case you haven't seen the video I've done on a Python for loop, as I do recommend going and watching that if you don't know what a for loop is. But you could say for name in names, we're going to say print name. And remember, you don't put names because names is the actual list here, and name is a variable that we effectively redefine every single iteration to be one specific element in the list, so iterating through it. So we can run that and then we'll get each of the names. So that's another way of sort of being able to access all the different sort of names in Python. There's one more thing now, so let's do another for loop, and we're going to say this time for I name in enumerate. So we haven't used enumerate yet, but it's basically going to put the index of each element into the variable I, and then it's going to put the contents of the element, right, into the name variable. So we could do for I name, then we're going to do print I name. So that is going to print out not only the name, but also its index, and in a really concise and efficient way in Python. So that's a really good way of being able to access the index and the name inside your Python for loop. So I thought I'd show you that, just like a quick little side, like bonus little tip of information. Remember, the index is referring to a specific element in the Python list. But one cool thing with using indexes is you can also use them with strings. So if you put a string and then you can put the square brackets on the end of that, that also works exactly the same as an element in the Python list. So I'm not going to show you an example of that because I want you to sort of really type out the code yourself, especially if you haven't done so this far in these tutorial series. Just type it out, have a play around with it, define your own Python list. It doesn't have to be integers necessarily, it could be strings, but just remember they have to be the same data type. Just play around with it. Maybe define a string and then try to get, a particular element out of that string using an index. So, like I showed you with the square brackets after the string variable. So you can do that, have a play around with it. So that's it for this video, but in the next one we're going to be talking about something which I think has a little bit of confusion around it, especially for beginners learning Python because of its sort of complicated name, but it's really not that complicated, and that's called global and local variable scope.